the preterite and imperfect tenses. When we think of grammatical tense, we generally think of three tenses: the past, the present, and the future. But the reality is that tense is a bit more complicated than that. And speaking of the present, for instance, we can distinguish between what happens, the present indicative, what is happening, the present progressive, and what has happened in the recent past, the present perfect. Likewise, in speaking of the past, we can speak of what happened, the preterite, what was happening, the imperfect, what had happened, the past perfect, and what would have happened, the past conditional. In this lesson, we will focus on two past tenses, the preterite and the imperfect. The term imperfect originates from the ideas of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who believed that if an entity had reached perfection, it would remain perfectly still, since being in a perfect state, any change could only be a change for the worse. It is not important that you know this fact to understand the difference between the imperfect and the preterite tenses in Spanish, but it may help you to remember that the imperfect is a verb tense that conveys the idea of motion, of something that is, in a sense, still going on in the past, whereas the preterite carries with it the notion of an action or situation that has, in a sense, been completed. So if a speaker were to say something along the lines of Cervantes published Don Quixote in 1605, he would be expressing an idea that would occasion the use of the Spanish preterite. Cervantes publicó Don Quixote en 1605. But if a speaker were to note that yesterday it was raining while he studied in the library, that idea would call for the imperfect. Ayer llovía mientras estudiaba en la biblioteca. In broad outlines, this is the distinction between preterite and imperfect, but in point of actual usage, it is best to approach the distinction between preterite and imperfect by studying a few rules associated with these tenses. As we have already seen, the preterite is usually used to describe actions that were completed in the past. Alejandro se durmió a las 9. Alejandro went to sleep at 9. Conversely, the imperfect describes actions that are, in a sense, still happening in the past. Hacía frío esa mañana. It was cold that morning. When an action in the past is interrupted by another action, the first action is described using the imperfect, whereas the action that interrupts is described using the preterite. Amanda leía el periódico cuando sonó el teléfono. Amanda was reading the newspaper when the telephone rang. A series of completed actions are usually described using the preterite. Alfonso se levantó a las 7, se duchó, tomó el desayuno y salió de casa a las 8:15. Alfonso woke up at 7, took a shower, had breakfast, and left home at 8:15. Recurring events in the past, however, are generally described using the imperfect. Cuando era niño, mis padres me llevaban al cine todos los sábados. When I was a child, my parents would take me to the movies every Saturday. The imperfect is also used when telling time in the past. Eran las 6:30. It was 6:30. But the preterite is used when describing when something happened. Paco llegó a las 8. Paco arrived at 8. The imperfect is often used when setting the stage for a story. En esa época, Alberto vivía en Barcelona. Alquilaba un piso modesto y trabajaba en un banco. In those days, Alberto lived in Barcelona. He rented an inexpensive apartment and worked at a bank. Finally, it is worth noting that there are a number of Spanish verbs whose meaning changes depending on whether the preterite or the imperfect is used. So, for instance, with the verb conocer, the imperfect describes the state of knowing something in the past. Julia conocía bien las calles de Madrid. Julia knew the streets of Madrid well, but the preterite of conocer is used when describing how two people met for the first time. Conocí a mi futura esposa en la Universidad de Guadalajara. I met my future wife at the University of Guadalajara. There are a number of Spanish verbs that show similar differences in meaning, depending on whether the imperfect or the preterite is used.